Section 22 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Daria Hrobok. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Fish Talk Part 2. The jaculator fish of Java has been called a sporting fish from the precision with which it takes aim at its prey. In 1828, Mr. Mitchell saw several of these fishes in the possession of a Javanese chief. And here is the account of the curious manner in which these jaculators were employed. They were placed in a small circular pond, from the center of which projected a pole upwards of 2 feet in height. At the top of the pole were inserted small pieces of wood, sharp-pointed, and on each of these were placed insects of the beetle tribe. When the slaves had placed the beetles, the fish came out of their holes and swam round the pond. One of them came to the surface of the water, rested there, and after steadily fixing its eyes for some time on an insect, it discharged from its mouth a small quantity of watery fluid, with such force and precision of aim as to strike it off the twig into the water, and in an instant swallowed it. After this, another fish came and performed a similar feat, and was followed by the others, until they had secured all the insects. If a fish failed in bringing down its prey at the first shot, it swam round the pond till it came opposite the same object and fired again. In one instance, a fish returned 3 times to the attack before it secured its prey. But in general, the fish seemed very expert gunners, bringing down the beetle at the first shot. The fish in a state of nature frequents the shores and sides of the rivers in search of food. When it spies a fly sitting on the plants that grow on shallow water, it swims on to the distance of 5 or 6 feet from them, and then, with surprising dexterity, it ejects out of its tubular mouth a single drop of water, which rarely fails to strike the fly into the sea, where it soon becomes its prey. Curious fish in great numbers may be seen in the harbor of Port Royal, Jamaica, on the surface of the water, and are ranked among the peculiarities of the place. They are the guardo, or guardfish, the jack, swordfish, and the balahoo. The jack is the largest and appears to be always at war with the 2 others. It is armed with formidable teeth. It basks on the surface of the water during the heat of the day, in a sort of indolent, unguarded state. But this is assumed the better to ensnare the other fish, and to catch the floating bodies that may happen to pass near it. For the moment anything is thrown into the sea from the ship, the jack darts with the rapidity of lightning upon it, and seizing it as quickly retreats. This warrior fish possesses a foresight or instinctive quality which we see sometimes exemplified in different animals, almost amounting to second reason, such as the sagacity it displays in avoiding the hook when baited. Although extremely voracious, it seems aware of the lure held out for its destruction, and avoids it with as much cunning as the generality of fishes show eagerness to devour it. The situation it takes immediately in the wake of the ship at anchor is another instance of its sagacity, as whatever is thrown overboard passes astern, where the fish is ever on the alert for the articles thrown over. No other fish of equal size dare approach. The jack is, however, sometimes enticed with the bait, but he is more frequently struck with a barbed lance or entrapped in a net. The guardo has similar habits with the jack, but is generally beaten by him. Yet the former tyrannizes with unrelenting rigor over the weaker associate, the balahoo. The tiger of the ocean, the shark, is often cruising about Port Royal, but rarely injures human life. At Kingston, however, such distressing events often occur. There was a pet shark known as Old Tom of Port Royal. It was fed whenever it approached any of the ships, but was at last killed by the father of a child which it had devoured. Whilst it remained here, no other of the shark tribe dare venture on his domain. He reigned lord paramount in his watery empire, and never committed any depredation but that for which he suffered. Attending the shark is seen the beautiful little pilotfish, who, first approaching the bait, returns as if to give notice when immediately after the shark approaches to seize it. It is a curious circumstance that this elegant little fish is seen in attendance only upon the shark. After the shark is hooked, the pilot fish still swims about, and for some time after he has been hauled on deck. It then swims very near the surface of the water. When the shark has been hooked and afterwards escapes, he generally returns and renews the attack with increased ferocity, irritated often by the wound he has received. Sharks appear to have become of late years much more numerous in Faroe, as they have also in other parts of the North Seas, especially on the coast of Norway. The reader may probably have found on the seashore certain cases which are fancifully called sea purses, mermaids' purses. Now some sharks bring forth their young alive, whilst others are enclosed in oblong, semi-transparent, horny cases, at each extremity of which are two long tendrils. These cases are the above purses, which the parent shark deposits near the shore in the winter months. The twisting tendrils hang to seaweed or other fixed bodies to prevent the cases being washed away into deep water. Two fissures, one at each end, allow the admission of seawater, and here the young shark remains until it has acquired the power of taking food by the mouth, when it leaves what resembles its cradle. The young fish ultimately escapes by an opening at the end, near which the head is situated. California has yielded an extraordinary novelty in fish history. In 1854, Mr. Jackson, while fishing in San Salita Bay, caught with a hook and line a fish of the perch family containing living young. These were supposed to be the prey which the fish had swallowed, but on opening the belly was found next to the back of the fish and slightly attached to it a long, very light violet bag, so clear and transparent that there could already be distinguished through it the shape, color, and formation of a multitude of small fish, all facsimiles of each other, with which the bag was filled. They were in all respects like the mother and like each other, and there cannot remain a single doubt that these young were the offspring of the fish from whose body they were taken, and that this species of fish gives birth to her young alive and perfectly formed and adapted to seek its own livelihood in the water. Professor Agassiz has confirmed the truth of this extraordinary statement by a careful examination of the specimens, and has ascertained that there are two very distinct species of this remarkable type of fishes. Tales of wonderful fish are common in the works of the old naturalists, whence they are quoted from generation to generation. Sir John Richardson has lately demolished one queer fish which was as certain to reappear whenever opportunity offered, as the elephant pricked with a tailor's needle does in books of stories of the animal world. We allude to that monstrous myth, the great Mannheim pike, with a collar round his neck, put into a lake by the Emperor Frederick II in the year 1230, and taken out in the 276th year of his age, the 17th foot of his length, and the 350th pound of his weight. M. Valenciennes, a naturalist of repute, has entered into a critical history of this monster, and has found him to be apocryphal. The creature was, at any rate, taken in several places at once. The legends written on his brass collar do not agree, and his alleged skeleton has been found to be made up of various bones of various fishes, while the vertebrae are unfortunately so many that Professor Owen would order him out of court in an instant as a rank impostor. Probably some specimen of the mecho, the monstrous fish of the Danube, which has even now been scarcely described and which has only recently been identified as one of the salmon tribe, having been called a pike, may be at the bottom of the legend of the great Mannheim fish. But Sir John Richardson produces another big pike, killed by an intrepid angler 70 years of age with a single rod and bait, an observation which leads to the inquiry of the possibility of catching a single fish with more than one rod and bait that weighed 78 pounds. This is stated to have happened in the country of Clare. The angler's name was O'Flanagan. Here's another wonderful story. The Bohemians have a proverb: every fish has another for prey. That named the wells has them all. This is the largest freshwater fish found in the rivers of Europe, except the sturgeon. It often reaches 5 or 6 feet in length. It destroys many aquatic birds, and we are assured that it does not spare the human species. On the 3rd of July, 1700, a peasant took one near Thorn, and that had an infant entire in its stomach. They tell in Hungary of children and young girls being devoured on going to draw water, and they even relate that on the frontiers of Turkey a poor fisherman took one that had in its stomach the body of a woman, her purse full of gold, and a ring. The fish is even reported to have been taken 16 feet long. The old stories of rings found in the stomachs of fishes will be remembered, as well as here and there a book found in the stomach of a fish. The sunfish is exceedingly rare. A large specimen was captured off St. Point in 1864. Attention was first drawn to a huge dark object on the water. On a boat being sent out, it was soon discovered to be the back fin of a very large fish, apparently asleep. A very exciting chase commenced, extending over an hour, the crew meanwhile battling with harpoons, boat hooks, the fish trying several times to upset the boat by getting his back under it. At length a line was thrown over its head, and the fish, being weakened by the struggle, was towed alongside the yacht, hoisted on board, and slaughtered. Gerald, in his book on British fishes, states the largest sunfish to be around 300 weight, but the above specimen weighed nearly 600 weight. Sunfish are found occasionally in the tropical seas of large dimensions, but those found in the channel seldom, if ever, exceed from 100 weight to 200 weight. The peculiarities in regard to this fish are that it has no bones, but the whole of the formation is of cartilage, which can easily be cut with a knife. The skin is cartilage of about 1.5 inches thick, under which there is no backbone or ribs. This specimen was of extraordinary dimensions, 5 feet 10 inches in length and 7 feet from the tip of the dorsal to the point of the anal fin. The Courrier de Sagan brings, as a contribution to natural history, the not very credible-sounding description of a fish called kauk in the Annamite tongue, which is said to have saved the lives already of several Annamites, for which reason the king of Annam has invested it with the name of Nam Haidui Bnongnan, great general of the South Sea. This fish is said to swim round ships near the coast, and when it sees a man in the water, to seize him with his mouth and to carry him ashore. A skeleton of this singular inhabitant of the deep is to be seen at Wang Tao near Cape St. James. It is reported to be 35 feet in length, to have tusks almost like an elephant, very large eyes, a black and smooth skin, a tail like a lobster, and 2 wings on its back. The grouper must be a voracious fish, for we read of a specimen being caught off the coast of Queensland, which is thus described. It was 7 feet long, 6 feet in circumference, and its thickest part and its head weighed 80 pounds. When opened, there were found in its stomach 2 broken bottles, a quart pot, a preserved milk tin, 7 medium-sized crabs, a piece of earthenware, triangular in shape and 3 inches in length, encrusted with oyster shells, a sheep's head, some mutton and beef bones, and some loose oyster shells. The spine of a skate was embedded in the grouper's liver. The double fish here represented is a pair of catfish which were taken alive in a shrimp net at the mouth of Cape Fear River near Fort Johnston, North Carolina, in 1833 and presented to Professor Silliman. One of them is 3.5 and the other 2.5 inches long, including the tail, the smallest emaciated and of sickly appearance. They are connected in the manner of the Siamese twins by the skin at the breast, which is marked by a dark streak at the line of union. The texture and color otherwise of the skin is the same as that of the belly. The mouth, viscera were entire and perfect in each fish, but on withdrawing the entrails through an incision made on one side of the abdomen, the connecting integument was found to be hollow. A flexible probe was passed through from one to the other with the tender and soft end of a spear of grass, drawn from a green plant. But there was no appearance of the entrails of one having come in contact with those of the other, for the integument was less than 1/10 of an inch in its whole thickness. In length, from the body or trunk of one fish to the other, it was 3/10. And in the water, when the largest fish was in its natural position, The small one could, by the length and pliancy of the skin, swim in near the same position. When these fish came to existence, it is probable they were of almost equal size and strength, but one born to better fortune, or exercising more ingenuity and industry than the other, gained a trifling ascendancy which he improved to increase the disparity and, by pushing his extended mouth in advance of the other, seized the choicest and most of the food for himself. From the northern parts of British America, we have received extraordinary contributions to our fish collections. One of these is the square-browed mulls, obtained in one of the land expeditions under the command of Captain Sir John Franklin, R.N. It was taken on the Labrador coast and then belonged to a species hitherto undescribed. Its intestines were filled with small crabs and univalve shells. The extreme length of the fish is 7 inches 11 lines. The upper surface is grayish-white with brown blotches and the fins are whitish. The head is much depressed and greatly widened, the eyes far forward, the snout projecting like a small horn. Most of the fish of this family can live long out of water, in consequence of the smallest of their gill openings. Indeed, those of one of the genera are able, even in warm countries, to pass 2 or 3 days in creeping over the land. All the family conceal themselves in the mud or sand, and lie in wait to take their prey by surprise. The accompanying engraving is from the very able work of Dr. Richardson, F.R.S., published by the munificence of government. Goldfish of the carp family have been made to distinguish a particular sound made by those from whom they receive their food. They recognize their footsteps at a distance and come at their call. Captain Brown says goldfish, when kept in ponds, are frequently taught to rise to the surface of the water at the sound of a bell to be fed. And Mr. Jesse was assured that goldfish evince much pleasure on being whistled to. Haeckel, in his Apology for God's Power and Providence, cites Pliny to show that a certain emperor had ponds containing fish which, when called by their respective names that were bestowed upon them, came to the spot whence the voice proceeded. Bernier, in his History of Hindustan, states a like circumstance of the fish belonging to the Great Mogul. The old poet Martial also mentions fish coming at the call, as will be seen by the following translation from one of his epigrams. Angler, couldn't thou be guiltless, then forbear, for these are sacred fishes that swim here, who know their sovereign and will lick his hand, than which none's greater in the world's command. Nay more, they've names, and when they called are due to their several owners call repair. Who, after reading so many instances, can doubt that fish hear? It has been found that the water from steam engines, which is thrown into dams or ponds for the purpose of being cooled, conduces much to the nutriment of goldfish. In these dams, the average temperature of which is about 80 degrees, it is common to keep goldfish, in which situation they multiply much more rapidly than in ponds of lower temperature exposed to variations in the climate. 3 pair of fish were put into one of these dams, where they increased so rapidly that at the end of 3 years, the progeny, which was accidentally poisoned by verdigris mixed with the refuse tallow from the engine, were taken out by wheelbarrow fowls. Goldfish are by no means useless inhabitants of these dams, as they consume the refuse grease which would otherwise impede the cooling of the water by accumulating on its surface. It is not improbable that this unusual supply of aliment may cooperate with increase of temperature in promoting the fecundity of the fishes. Most of our readers have heard of the fish popularly known as the miller's thumb, the origin of the name of which Mr. Jarrell has thus explained. It is well known that all the science and tact of a miller is directed so to regulate the machinery of his mill that the meal produced shall be of the most valuable description that the operation of grinding will permit, when performed under the most advantageous circumstances. His ear is constantly directed to the note made by the running stone in its circular course over the bedstone. The exact parallelism of their two surfaces, indicated by a particular sound, being a matter of the first consequence. And his hand is constantly placed under the meal spout to ascertain by actual contact the character and quality of the meal produced, which he does by a particular movement of his thumb in spreading the sample over his fingers. By this incessant action of the miller's thumb, a peculiarity in its shape is produced, which is said to resemble exactly the shape of the river bullhead, a fish constantly found in the mill stream, and which has obtained for it the name of the miller's thumb. M. Coste has constructed a kind of marine observatory at Concarneau, Finistère, for the purpose of studying the habits and instincts of various sea fish. A terrace has been formed on the top of a house on the quay, with reservoirs arranged like a flight of steps. The seawater is pumped up to the topmost reservoir and hence flows down slowly after the manner of a rivulet. The length is divided into 95 cells by wire net partitions, which, allowing free passage to the water, yet prevent the different species of fish from mingling together. By this ingenious contrivance, each kind lives separate, enjoying its peculiar food and habits, unconscious of its state of captivity. Some species, such as the mullet, the stickleback, grow perfectly tame, will follow the hand that offers them food, and will even allow themselves to be taken out of the water. The goby and bullhead are less familiar. The turbot, which looks so unintelligent, will nevertheless take food from the hand. It changes color when irritated, the spots with which it is covered growing pale or dark according to the emotions excited in it. But the most curious circumstance concerning it is that it swallows fish of a much larger size than would appear compatible with the apparent smallness of its mouth. Thus, a young turbot, not more than 10 inches in length, has been seen to swallow pilchards of the largest size. The pipefish has two peculiarities. These fish form groups, entwining their tails together and remaining immovable in a vertical position, with their heads upwards. When food is offered them, they perform a curious evolution. They turn round on their backs to receive it. This is owing to the peculiar position of the mouth, which is placed under a kind of beak and perpendicular to its axis. The crustaceous tribes have also furnished much matter of observation. The prawn and crab, for instance, exercises the virtue of conjugal fidelity to the highest degree. For the male takes hold of his mate and never lets her go. He swims with her, crawls about with her, and if she is forcibly taken away from him, he seizes hold of her again. The metamorphoses to which various crustaceous tribes are subject have also been studied with much attention. Much as the nature and habits of fish have been studied of late years, the economy of some is to this day involved in obscurity. The herring is one of these fishes. The Swedish herring fisheries were at one time the largest in Europe, but at present, during the temporary disappearance of the fish, they have dwindled away. The causes which influence the movements of the herring, one of the most capricious of fish, are a puzzle which naturalists have as yet failed to solve. They are not migratory, as was at one time believed, that is, they seldom wander far from the place where they were bred. But they are influenced by certain hidden and unexplained causes at one time to remain for years in the deep sea, and at another to come close into land in enormous numbers. During the first half of the 16th century, herrings entirely deserted the Swedish coasts. In 1556, they reappeared and remained for 31 years in the shallow waters. Throughout this period, they were taken in incalculable numbers. Thousands of ships came annually from Denmark, Germany, Friesland, Holland, England, and France to purchase the fish, of which sufficient were always found for them to carry away to their own or other countries. From the small town of Marstrand alone, some 2,400,000 bushels were yearly exported. In 1587, the herrings disappeared and remained absent for 73 years, till 1660. In 1727, they returned, and again in 1747, remaining till 1808, and during this last period the fisheries were prosecuted with extraordinary zeal, industry, and success. The government gave every encouragement to settlers, and it was computed that during some years as many as 50,000 strangers took part in them. In 1808, the herrings once more disappeared and have never returned since. The cause must still be considered as unique unknown, but we may fairly assume, according to historical precedents, that after a certain period of absence the herrings will again return. Aristotle, in his History of Animals, makes some extremely curious observations on fish and cetaceous animals, as might be expected from the variety of these animals in the Grecian seas. In Spratt and Forbes' Travels in Syria, the account of the habits and structure of the cuttlefish in Aristoteles' work is ranked amongst the most admirable natural history essays ever written. It is, moreover, remarkable for its anticipation. Dr. Osborne in 1840 read to the Royal Society a short analysis of this work in which he showed that Aristotle anticipated Dr. Jenner's researches respecting the cuckoo, as also some discoveries respecting the incubated egg, which were published as new in the above year. Aristotle describes the economy of bees as we have it at present, but mistakes the sex of the queen. The various organs are described as modified throughout the different classes of animals, beginning with man, in nearly the same order as that afterwards adopted by Cuvier. The chief value of this body of knowledge, which has been buried for above 2,000 years, is that it is a collection of facts observed under peculiar advantages, such as never since occurred, and that it is at the present day to be consulted for new discoveries. According to Pliny, for the above work some thousands of men were placed at Aristotle's disposal throughout Greece and Asia, comprising persons connected with hunting and fishing, or who had the care of cattle, fish ponds, and apiaries, in order that he might obtain information from all quarters. Ne quid usquam gentium ignoretur ab eo. According to Athenaeus, Aristotle received from the prince, on account of the expenses of the work, 800 talents, or upwards of 79,000 L.
Section 23 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Fish in British Columbia. In this bitterly cold country, where the snow lies deep 6 months out of the 12, the natives subsist principally on fish, of which there is an extraordinary abundance generally, and of salmon particularly. Salmon swarm in such numbers that the rivers cannot hold them. In June and July, every rivulet, no matter how shallow, is so crammed with salmon that, from sheer want of room, they push one another high and dry upon the pebbles. And Mr. Lord tells us that each salmon, with its head up, struggles, fights, and scuffles for precedence. With one's hands only, or more easily by employing a gaff or a crook stick, tons of salmon have been procured by the simple process of hooking them out. Once started on their journey, the salmon never turn back. As fast as those in front die, fresh arrivals crowd on to take their places and share their fate. It is a strange and novel sight to see 3 moving lines of fish, the dead and dying in the eddies and slack water along the bank, the living breasting the current in the centre, blindly pressing on to perish like their kindred. For 2 months this great salmon army proceeds on its way upstream, furnishing a supply of food without which the Indians must perish miserably. The winters are too severe for them to venture out in search of food, even if there was any to be obtained. From being destitute of salt, they are unable to cure meat in the summer for winter provisions, and hence for 6 months in the year they depend upon salmon, which they preserve by drying in the sun. But the Indian has another source of provision for the winter, fully as important as the salmon. The candlefish supplies him at once with light butter and oil. Footnote 19. The petrel is similarly used in the Faroe Islands. See ante page 234. It may therefore be called the candle bird. End footnote. When dried and perforated with a rush or strip of cypress bark, it can be lighted and burns steadily until consumed. Strung up and hung for a time in the smoke of a wood fire, it is preserved as a fatty morsel to warm him when pinched with cold, and, by heat and pressure, it is easily converted into liquid oil and drunk with avidity. That nothing may be wanting, the hollow stalk of the sea wrack, which at the root is expanded into a complete flask, makes an admirable bottle. And so, when the Indian buries himself for long dreary months in his winter quarters, neither his larder nor his cellar are empty, and he has a lamp to lighten the darkness. The steamers have, however, frightened away the candlefish and the Indian from their old haunts, and they have both retreated to the north of the Columbia River. Amongst the other inhabitants of the salt and fresh waters of these regions are the halibut and the sturgeon, both of which attain to an immense size. The bays and inlets along the coast abound with marine wonders. There feasts and fattens the clam, a bivalve so gigantic that no oyster knife can force an entrance, and only when his shell is almost red hot will he be at last constrained to open his dwelling. And there lies in wait the awful octopus, a monster of insatiable voracity, of untamable ferocity, and of consummate craft, of sleepless vigilance, shrouded amidst the forests of seaweed, and from the touch of whose terrible arms no living thing escapes. It attains to an enormous size in those seas, the arms being sometimes 5 feet in length, and as thick at the base as a man's wrist. No bather would have a chance if he once got within the grasp of such a monster, nor could a canoe resist the strength of its pull. But the Indian, who devours the octopus with great relish, has all the cunning created by necessity, and takes care that none of the 8 sucker-dotted arms ever gain a hold on his frail bark. Professor Owen has figured a species of octopus, the 8-armed cuttle of the European seas, representing it in the act of creeping on shore, its body being carried vertically in the reverse position, with its head downwards, and its back being turned towards the spectator upon whom it is supposed to be advancing. This animal is said to be luminous in the dark. Linnaeus quotes Bartholinus for the statement that one gave so much light that when the candle was taken away, it illuminated the room. The sturgeon is one of the finest fishes of the country, and Mr. Lord's account of the Indian mode of taking them is a very graphic picture of this river sport. The spearman stands in the bow armed with a most formidable spear. The handle, from 70 to 80 feet long, is made of white pine wood. Fitted on the spear haft is a barbed point, in shape very much like a shuttlecock, supposing each feather represented by a piece of bone, thickly barbed and very sharp at the end. This is so contrived that it can be easily detached from the long handle by a sharp, dexterous jerk. To this barbed contrivance a long line is made fast, which is carefully coiled away close to the spearman, like a harpoon line in a whaleboat. The 4 canoes, alike equipped, are paddled into the centre of the stream, and side by side drift slowly down with the current, each spearman carefully feeling along the bottom with his spear, constant practice having taught the crafty savages to know a sturgeon's back when the spear comes in contact with it. The spear head touches the drowsy fish, a sharp plunge, and the red skin sends the notched points through armour and cartilage deep into the leather-like muscles. A skillful jerk frees the long handle from the barbed end, which remains inextricably fixed in the fish. The handle is thrown aside, the line seized, and the struggle begins. The first impulse is to resist this objectionable intrusion, so the angry sturgeon comes up to see what it all means. This curiosity is generally repaid by having a second spear sent crashing into him. He then takes a header, seeking safety in flight, and the real excitement commences. With might and main the bowman plies the paddle, and the spearman pays out the line, the canoe flying through the water. The slightest tangle, the least hitch, and over it goes. It becomes, in fact, a sheer trial of paddle versus fin. Twist and turn as the sturgeon may, all the canoes are with him. He flings himself out of the water, dashes through it, under it, and skims along the surface. But all is in vain. The canoes and their dusky oarsmen follow all his efforts to escape, as a cat follows a mouse. Gradually the sturgeon grows sulky and tired, obstinately floating on the surface. The savage knows he is not vanquished, but only biding a chance for revenge. So he shortens up the line and gathers quietly on him to get another spear in. It is done, and down viciously dives the sturgeon, but pain and weariness begin to tell. The struggles grow weaker and weaker as life ebbs slowly away, until the mighty armour-plated monarch of the river yields himself a captive to the dusky native in his frail canoe. There is a very rare spoonbill sturgeon found in the western waters of North America. Its popular name is paddlefish. One 5 feet in length weighed 40 pounds. The nose, resembling a spatula, was 13 inches in length. It was of a light slate colour, spotted with black, belly white, skin smooth like an eel, the flesh compact and firm, and hard when boiled, not very enticing to the epicure. The jaws are without teeth, but the forces are lined with several tissues of the most beautiful network, evidently for the purpose of collecting its food from the water by straining or passing it through these membranes in the same manner as practiced by the spermaceti whale. Near the top of the head are 2 small holes, through which it is possible the sturgeon may discharge water in the manner practiced by cetaceous animals. It is conjectured that the long spoonbill nose of this fish is for digging up or moving the soft mud in the bottom of the river, and when the water is fully saturated, draw it through the filamentary strainers in search of food. Sturgeons resemble sharks in their general form, but their bodies are defended by bony shields, disposed in longitudinal rows, and their head is also well cuirassed externally. The sturgeons of North America are of little benefit to the natives. A few speared in the summertime suffice for the temporary support of some Indian hordes, but none are preserved for winter use, and the roe and sounds are utterly wasted. The northern limit of the sturgeon in America is probably between the 55th and 56th parallels of latitude. Dr. Richardson did not meet with any account of its existence to the north of Stewart's Lake, on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, and on the east side it does not go higher than the Saskatchewan and its tributaries. It is not found in Churchill River, nor in any of the branches of the Mackenzie or other streams that fall into the Arctic seas, a remarkable circumstance when we consider that some species swarm in the Asiatic rivers which flow into the icy sea. Sturgeons occur in all the Great Lakes communicating with the St. Lawrence, and also along the whole Atlantic coast of the United States down to Florida. Peculiar species inhabit the Mississippi. It is, therefore, probable that the range of the genus extends to the Gulf of Mexico. The great rapid which forms the discharge of the Saskatchewan into Lake Winnipeg appears quite alive with these fish in the month of June, and some families of the natives resort hither at that time to spear them with a harpoon or grapple them with a strong hook tied to a pole. Notwithstanding the great muscular power of the sturgeon, it is timid, and Dr. Richardson saw one is so frightened at the paddling of a canoe that ran its nose into a muddy bank and was taken by a voyager who leaped upon its back. In Columbia River, a small species of sturgeon attains 11 feet in length and a weight of 600 pounds. Footnote 20. Dr. Richardson, the hero, is reported by Pallas to attain a weight of nearly 3,000 pounds and a length exceeding 30 feet. End footnote. It is caught as high up as Fort Colville, notwithstanding the numerous intervening cataracts and rapids which seem to be insuperable barriers to a fish so sluggish in its movements. The sturgeon is styled a royal fish in England because, by a statute of Edward II, it is enacted, "The king shall have sturgeon taken in the sea or elsewhere within the realm." End of section 23, read by Cassandra Franulovich, Sydney, Australia, January 2024.
Section 24 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. The Tree-Climbing Crab. The transition from the ordinary mode of the locomotion of fishes by swimming to that of climbing has been ably illustrated by the Reverend Dr. Buckland, who showed in a communication to the Ashmolean Society in 1843 that the fins in certain genera perform the functions of feet and wings. Thus, fishing frogs have the fins converted into feet or paddles, by means of which they have the power of crawling or hopping on sand and mud, and other species can live 3 days out of the water and walk upon dry land. The climbing perch of the Indian rivers is known to live a long time in the air, and to climb up the stems of palm trees in pursuit of flies, by means of spinous projections on its gill covers. Fishes of the Silurus family have a bony enlargement of the first ray of the pectoral fin, which is also armed with spines, and this is not only an offensive and defensive weapon, but enables the fish to walk along the bottom of the fresh waters which it inhabits. The flying fishes are notorious examples of the conversion of fins into an organ of movement in the air. M. Deslongchamps has published in the Transactions of the Linnaean Society of Normandy, 1842, a curious account of the movements of the gurnard at the bottom of the sea. In 1839 he observed these movements in one of the artificial fishing ponds or fishing traps, surrounded by nets on the shore of Normandy. He saw a score of gurnards closing their fins against their sides, like the wing of a fly in repose, and without any movement of their tails, walking along the bottom by means of 6 free rays, 3 on each pectoral fin, which they placed successively on the ground. They moved rapidly forwards, backwards, to the right and left, groping in all directions with these rays, as if in search of small crabs. Their great heads and bodies seemed to throw hardly any weight on the slender rays, or feet, being suspended in water, and having their weight further diminished by their swimming bladder. During these movements, the gurnards resembled insects moving along the sand. When M. Deslongchamps moved in the water, the fish swam away rapidly to the extremity of the pond. When he stood still, they resumed their ambulatory movement and came between his legs. On dissection, we find these 3 anterior rays of the pectoral fins to be supported each with strong muscular apparatus to direct their movements, apart from the muscles that are connected with the smaller rays of the pectoral fin. Dr. Buckland states that Miss Potts of Chester had sent to him a flagstone from a coal shaft at Mustin, bearing impressions which she supposed to be the trackway of some fish crawling along the bottom by means of the anterior rays of its pectoral fins. There were no indications of feet, but only scratches symmetrically disposed on each side of a space that may have been covered by the body of the fish whilst making progress, by pressing its fin bones on the bottom. As yet, no footsteps of reptiles or of any animals more highly organized than fishes have been found in strata older than those which belong to the new red sandstone. The abundant remains of fossil fishes, armed with strong bony spines, and of other fishes allied to the gurnard, in strata of the Carboniferous and Old Red Sandstone series, would lead us to expect the frequent occurrence of impressions made by their locomotive organs on the bottoms of the ancient waters in which they lived. Dr. Buckland proposed to designate these petrified traces or trackways of ancient fishes by the term of fish tracks. Crabs and lobsters are strange creatures, strange in their configurations, strange in the transmutations which they exhibit from the egg to maturity, strange in the process they undergo of casting off not only their shell, but the covering of their eyes, of their long horns, and even the lining of their tooth-furnished stomach. Strange also are they in their manners and habits. Many a reader, in wandering along the seashore, may have disturbed little colonies of crabs quietly nestling in fancied security amidst banks of slimy seaweed, and in the nooks and recesses of the coast, the shallows and strips of land left dry at ebb tide, may be seen numbers of little, or perchance large, crabs, some concealed in snug lurking places, others tripping with a quick sidelong movement over the beach, alarmed by the advance of an unwelcome intruder. Some are exclusively tenants of the water, have feet formed like paddles for swimming, and never venture on land. Others seem to love the air and sunshine, and enjoy an excursion not without hopes of finding an acceptable repast over the oozy sands. Some, equally fond of the shore and shallow water, appropriate to themselves the shells of periwinkles, whelks, etc., and there live in a sort of castle which they drag about with them on their excursions, changing it for a larger as they increase in measure of growth. They vary in size from microscopic animalcules to the gigantic king crab. Footnote: this crab has an elongated spine-like tail, the use of which was long misunderstood. Dr. J. Gray was shown at the Liverpool Museum some living king crabs and the use they made of the tail-like appendages. When turned over on their backs, he saw them bend down the tail until they could reach some point of resistance, and then employ it to elevate the body and regain their normal position. Dr. Gray states that they never have been seen to use this tail for the purpose which has often been assigned to it, that is, for leaping from place to place by bending it under the body, like the toy called a spring jack or leaping frog. End of footnote. To the former, the luminosity of the ocean or of the foam before the prows of vessels is to a great extent attributable, each minute creature glowing with phosphoric light. The Bernhardt crab has been proved to have the power of dissolving shells, it not being unusual to find the long fusiform shells which are inhabited by these animals with the inner lip and the greater part of the pillar on the inside of the mouth destroyed, so as to render the aperture much larger than usual. Dr. Gray is quite convinced that these crabs have the above power, some to a much greater degree than others. Certain crabs, especially in the West Indies, are almost exclusively terrestrial, visiting the sea only at given periods for the deposition of their eggs. These crabs carry in their gill chambers sufficient water for the purpose of respiration. They live in burrows and traverse considerable tracts of land in the performance of their migratory journeys. Of these, some, as the violet crab, are exquisite delicacies. Of a great crab migration we find these details in the Jamaica Royal Gazette. In 1811 there was a very extraordinary production of black crabs in the eastern part of Jamaica. In June or July the whole district of Manchitneed was covered with countless numbers, swarming from the sea to the mountains. Of this the writer was an eye-witness. On ascending over hill from the vale of Plantain Garden River, the road appeared of a reddish colour as if strewed with brick dust. It was owing to myriads of young black crabs about the size of the nail of a man's finger, moving at a pretty quick pace, direct for the mountains. I rode along the coast, says the writer, quote, a distance of about 15 miles, and found it nearly the same the whole way. Returning the following day, I found the road still covered with them, the same as the day before. How have they been produced, and where do they come from? Were questions everybody asked, and nobody could answer. It is well known that crabs deposit their eggs once a year in May, but except on this occasion, though living on the coast, I have never seen above a dozen young crabs together, and here were myriads. No unusual number of old crabs had been observed in that season, and it is worthy of note that they were moving from a rock-bound coast of inaccessible cliffs, the abode of seabirds, and exposed to the constant influence of the trade winds. No person, as far as I know, ever saw the like, except on that occasion, and I have understood that since 1811 black crabs have been more abundant further into the interior of the island than they were ever known before. End quote. Cuvier describes the burrowing crab as displaying wonderful instinct. Quote, the animal closes the entrance of its burrow, which is situated near the margin of the sea or in marshy grounds, with its largest claw. These burrows are cylindrical, oblique, very deep, and very close to each other, but generally each burrow is the exclusive habitation of a single individual. The habit which these crabs have of holding their large claw elevated in advance of the body, as if making a sign of beckoning to someone, has obtained for them the name of calling crabs. There is a species observed by Mr. Bosque in South Carolina, which passes the 3 months of the winter in its retreat without once quitting it, and which never goes to the sea except at the epoch of egg-laying. End quote. The same observations apply to the chevalier crabs, so called from the celerity with which they traverse the ground. These are found in Africa and along the borders of the Mediterranean. Some crabs, truly aquatic as the vaulted crab of the Moluccas, have the power of drawing back their limbs and concealing them in a furrow, which they closely fit, and thus, in imitation of a tortoise, which retracts its feet and head within its shell, they secure themselves when alarmed. Other aquatic species have their limbs adapted for clinging to weeds and other marine objects. Of these, some have the 2 or 4 hind pairs of limbs so placed as to appear to spring from the back. They terminate in a sharp hook, by means of which the crab attaches itself to the valves of shells, fragments of coral, etc., which it draws over its body, and thus lurks in concealment. Allied in some respects to the hermit or soldier crabs, which tenant empty shells, is one which, from its manners and habits, is one of the most extraordinary of its race. The hermit crabs are voracious and feed on animal substances. The hermit or Bernhardt crab is so called from its habit of taking up its solitary residence in deserted shells. thus seeking a protection for its tail, which is long and naked. It is found in shells of different dimensions, and from time to time leaves its abode as it feels a necessity for a more commodious dwelling. It is said to present on such occasions an amusing instinct as it inserts the tail successively into several empty shells until one is found to fit. We learn from Professor Bell, however, that it does not always wait until the home is vacant, but occasionally rejects the rightful occupant with some violence. On the contrary, the crab, or rather lobster crab, for it takes an intermediate place between them, is more delicate in its appetite and feeds upon fruits, to obtain which it is said to climb up certain trees, at the feet of which it makes a burrow. This species is the purse crab, or robber crab, of Amboyna and other islands in the South Pacific Ocean. Quote, "According to popular belief among the Indians," says Cuvier, "the robber crab feeds on the nuts of the cocoa tree, and it makes its excursions during the night. Its places of retreat are fissures in the rocks or holes in the ground." End quote. The accounts of the early writers and travellers, as well as of the natives, were disbelieved, but their truth has since been abundantly confirmed. Messrs. Coy and Guimard assure us that several robber crabs were fed by them for many months on cocoa-nuts alone, and a specimen of this crab was submitted to the Zoological Society with additional information from Mr. Cumming, in whose fine collection from the islands of the South Pacific several specimens were preserved. Mr. Cumming states these crabs to be found in great numbers in Lord Hood's Island in the Pacific. He there frequently met with them on the road. On being disturbed, the crabs instantly assume a defensive attitude, making a loud snapping with their powerful claws or pincers, which continued as they retreated backwards. They climb a species of palm to gather a small kind of cocoa-nut that grows thereon. They live at the roots of trees and not in the holes of rocks, and they form a favourite food among the natives. Such is the substance of Mr. Cumming's account. Mr. Darwin, in his researches in geology and natural history, saw several of these crabs in the Keeling Islands, or Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean, about 600 miles distant from the coast of Sumatra. In these islands, of coral formation, the coconut tree is so abundant as to appear at first glance to compose the whole wood of the islands. Here the great purse crab is abundant. Mr. Darwin describes it as a crab which lives on the coconut, is common on all parts of the dry land, and grows to a monstrous size. This crab has its front pair of legs terminated by very strong and heavy pincers, and the last pair by others which are narrow and weak. It would at first be thought quite impossible for a crab to open a strong coconut, covered with the husk, but Mr. Lisk assures me that he has repeatedly seen the operation effected. The crab begins by tearing away the husk, fibre by fibre, and always from that end under which the 3 eye holes are situated. When this is completed, the crab commences hammering with its heavy claws on one of those eye holes till an opening is made. Then, turning its body by the aid of its posterior and narrow pair of pincers, it extracts the white albuminous substance. I think this is as curious a case as I ever heard of, and likewise of adaptation in structure between 2 objects apparently so remote from each other in the scheme of nature as a crab and a coconut tree. The crab is diurnal in its habits, but it is said to pay every night a visit to the sea for the purpose of moistening its gills. These gills are very peculiar, and scarcely fill up more than 1/10 of the chamber in which they are placed. It doubtless acts as a reservoir for water to serve the crab in its passage over the dry and heated land. The young are hatched and live for some time on the coast. At this period of existence we cannot suppose that coconuts form any part of their diet. Most probably soft saccharine grasses, fruits, and certain animal matters serve as their food until they attain a certain size and strength. The adult crabs, Mr. Darwin tells us, inhabit deep burrows, which they excavate beneath the roots of trees, and here they accumulate great quantities of the picked fibres of the coconut husk, on which they rest as on a bed. The Malays sometimes take advantage of the labours of the crab by collecting the coarse fibrous substance and using it as junk. These crabs are very good to eat. Moreover, under the tail of the larger ones there is a great mass of fat, which, when melted, yields as much as a quart bottleful of limpid oil. The crab's means of obtaining the coconuts have, however, been much disputed. It is stated by some authors to crawl up the trees for the purpose of stealing the nuts, This is doubted, though in the kind of palm to which Mr. Cumming refers as being ascended by this crab, the task would be much easier. Now Mr. Darwin states that in the Keeling Islands the crab lives only on the nuts which fall to the ground. It may thus appear that Mr. Cumming's and Mr. Darwin's respective accounts of the non-climbing of this crab on the one side and its actually climbing trees on the other are contradictory. The height of the stem of the coconut tree, its circumference, and comparative external smoothness would prove insurmountable, or at least very serious obstacles to the most greedy crab, however large and strong it might be. But these difficulties are by no means so formidable in the tree specified by Mr. Cumming. It is arborescent or bushy, with long, thin, rigid, sword-shaped leaves, resembling those of the pineapple, usually arranged spirally so that they are commonly called screw pines. They are of the genus Pandanus, a word derived from the Malay pandang. The ascent of these arborescent plants, having the stem furnished with a rigging of cord-like roots and bearing a multitude of firm, long, and spirally arranged leaves, would be by no means a work of difficulty, as would necessarily be that of the tall feathery-topped cocoa tree, destitute of all available points of aid or support. Hence the contradiction in the two accounts referred to is seeming and not real, and the two statements are reconciled. To sum up, Mr. Cumming fully testifies to the crab climbing the screw pines, and he has told Professor Owen that he has actually seen the crab climbing the coconut tree. The crab has been kept on coconuts for months, and is universally reported by the natives to climb the trees at night. We may here, too, observe that fine specimens of the climbing crab are to be seen in the British Museum. Here, too, arranged in cases, are spider crabs, crabs with oysters growing on their backs, thus showing that crabs do not shed their shells every year, or that the oyster increases very rapidly in bulk, oval-bodied crabs, and fin-footed or swimming crabs. Here are also telescope or long-eyed crabs and land crabs found in India 4,000 feet above the sea level. Another of similar habits in the plains of the Deccan that may be seen swarming in the fields, some cutting and nipping the green rice stalks, and others waddling off backwards with sheaves bigger than themselves. To these may be added square-bodied crabs, crested crabs, porcelain crabs with delicate china-like shells, and death's-head crabs, which usually form cases for themselves from pieces of sponge and shells. Certain species of crabs are remarkably tenacious of life, and have been known to live for weeks buried and without food. It is in the crab tribe that the fact of the metamorphosis of crustacea has been most distinctly perceived, a small, peculiar crustacean animal that had long passed for a distinct species under the name of zoea, having at length been identified with the young of the common crab before it had attained its full development. That among the crab tribes a tree-climbing species is to be found is certainly curious, but it is not without a parallel among fishes. Many of the latter leave the water, some even for a long time, and perform overland journeys aided in their progress by the structure of their fins. In these fishes the gills and gill chambers are constructed for the retention of water for a considerable time, so as to suffice for the necessary degree of respiration. In our country we may mention the eel, which often voluntarily quits the river or lake and wanders during the night over the adjacent meadows, probably in quest of dew worms. But the marshes of India and China present us with fishes much more decidedly terrestrial, and some of which were known to the ancients. Among these are several fishes of a snake-like form. They have an elongated cylindrical body, and creep on land to great distances from their native waters. The boatmen of India often keep these fishes for a long time out of water, for the sake of diverting themselves and others by their terrestrial movements, and children may often be seen enjoying this sport. Of these land-haunting fishes, the most remarkable is the tree climber, so called in Tranquebar. This fish inhabits India, the Indian Islands, and various parts of China as Chusan, etc., living in marshes and feeding on aquatic insects, worms, etc. According to Daldorf, a Danish gentleman who in 1797 communicated an account of the habits of this fish to the Linnean Society, it mounts up the bushes or low palms to some elevation. This gentleman states that he had himself observed it in the act of ascending palm trees near the marshes, and had taken it at a height of no less than 5 feet, measured from the level of the adjacent water. It effects its ascent by means of its pectoral and under fins, aided by the action of the tail and the spines which border the gill covers. It is by the same agency that it traverses the land. The statement of M. Daldorf is corroborated by M. John, also a Danish observer, to whom we are indebted for the knowledge of its name in Tranquebar, which alludes to its arboreal proceedings. It is true that many other naturalists who have observed the habits of this fish in its native regions, while they concur in describing its terrestrial journeys and in its living for a long time out of water, either omit to mention, or mention with doubt, its reputed attempts at tree climbing. The habits and instincts of certain crawfishes are very extraordinary. Thus the Astaki are migratory, and in their travels are capable of doing much damage to dams and embankments. On the Little Genesee River, they have, within a few years, compelled the owner of a dam to rebuild it. The former dam was built after the manner of dikes, that is, with upright posts supporting sleepers, laid inclining up the stream. On these were laid planks, and the planks were covered with dirt. The Astakas, proceeding up the stream, would burrow under the planks where they rested on the bottom of the stream, removing bushels of dirt and gravel in the course of a night. They travel over the dam in their migrations, often climbing posts 2 or 3 feet high to gain the pond above. We have to add a new and eccentric variety of nature, the pill-making crab, which abounds at Labuan, Singapore, and Lahore, and is described in Mr. Collingwood's Rambles of a Naturalist. When the tide is down, this little creature, if stealthily watched, may be seen creeping up a hole in the sandy shore, taking up rapidly particles of the loose powdery sand in its claws, and depositing them in a groove beneath the thorax. A little ball of sand about the size of a filbert is forthwith projected, though whether it passes actually through the mouth is not made clear. Pill after pill is seized with one claw, and laid aside until the beach is covered with these queer little pellets. This is evidently the creature's mode of extracting particles of food from the sand. Mr. Collingwood also describes, as met with on the shores and waters of the China seas, glass crabs, whose flat, transparent, leaf-like bodies seem made of fine plates of mica. The dredge brings up many a rich haul of sponges, corals, and gorgoniae of the most splendid colours, certain of the sponges harbouring within their cells minute crabs of a new genus. Between Aden and Galle, the sea is of a pinkish colour, owing to the immense accumulation of minute kinds of medusae in solid masses of red jelly. Over Fiery Cross Reef, the mirror-like sea reveals at the depth of 60 or 70 feet this wealth of natural treasures. Quote, glorious masses of living coral strew the bottom, immense globular madrepores, vast overhanging mushroom-shaped expansions, complicated ramifications of interweaving branches mingled with smaller and more delicate species, round, finger-shaped, horn-like, and umbrella-form, lie in wondrous confusion. Here and there is a large clamshell wedged in between masses of coral, the gaping zigzag mouth covered with the projecting mantle of the deepest Prussian blue. Beds of dark purple, long-spined echini, and the thick black bodies of sea cucumbers vary the aspect of the sea bottom. End of section 24, read by Sandra in Nova Scotia, 2024.
Section 25 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by David Lawrence in Ottawa, Ontario. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Musical Lizards. A small lizard, lately brought home from the Isle of Formosa by Mr. Swinhoe, is decided to be a new species by Dr. Gunter of the British Museum. Mr. Swinhoe found the eggs of this gecko, or lizard, in holes of walls or among mortar rubbish. They are round and usually lie several together, resembling eggs of ordinary lizards. The young, when first hatched, keep much under stones in dark cellars, where they remain until they attain about 2/3 of the adult size, when they begin to appear in public to catch insects, but evincing great shyness of their seniors. Mr. Swinhoe states that on the plaster-washed sides of his bedroom, close to the angle of the roof, every evening when the lamp was placed on the table below, 4 little musical lizards used to make their appearance, and watch patiently for insects attracted by the light. A sphinx or a beetle buzzing into the room would put them into great excitement, and they would run with celerity from one part of the wall to the other, after the deluded insect, as it fluttered in vain, buffeting its head up and down the wall. 2 or 3 would run after the same insect, but as soon as one had succeeded in securing it, the rest would prudently draw aloof. In running over the perpendicular face of the wall, they keep so close, and their movements are made so quickly, with one leg in advance of the other, that they have the appearance, at a distance, of gliding rather than running. The tail is somewhat writhed as the body is jerked along, and so much when the animal is alarmed and doing its utmost to escape, but its progress even then is in short runs, stopping at intervals and raising its head to look about. If a fly perch on a wall, it cautiously approaches to within a short distance, then suddenly darts forward and with its quick protruding glutinous tongue fixes it. Apart from watching its curious maneuvers after its insect food, the attention of the most listless would be attracted by the singular series of loud notes these creatures utter at all hours of the day and night, more especially during cloudy and raining weather. These notes resemble the syllables chuck, chuck, several times repeated, and, from their more frequent occurrence during July and August, they are thought to be the call notes of the male to the female. During the greater part of the day, the little creature lies quiescent in some cranny among the beams of the roof, or in the wall of the house, where, however, it is ever watchful for the incautious fly that approaches its den, upon whom it darts forth with but little notice. But it is by no means confined to the habitat of men. Every old wall and almost every tree possesses a tenant or two of this species. It is excessively lively, and even when found quietly ensconced in a hole, generally manages to escape. Its glittering little eyes, black with yellow ochre iris, appears to know no sleep, and an attempt to capture the runaway seldom results in more than seizure of an animated tail, wrenched off with a jerk by the little fellow as it slips away without loss of blood. The younger individuals are much darker than the larger and older animals, which are sometimes almost albinos. In ordinary fly-catching habitats, they stick to the sides of a lamp. There is much similarity between this gecko and the little pepu, or wall lizard of China, but this is decidedly a larger and more active animal, and often engages in a struggle with insects of a very large size. The Chinese colonists of Formosa greatly respect the geckos, in consequence of a legend which attributes to them the honor of having once poisoned the supplies of an invading rebellious army, which was thereby totally cut to pieces. The geckos were raised to the rank of generals by the grateful Emperor of China, which honor, the legend states, they greatly appreciated, and henceforth devoted their energies to the extermination of mosquitoes and other injurious insects. End of section 25.
Section 26 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.
For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Chameleons and Their Changes. Nil fuit unquam sic impar sibi. Horatio. Sure, such a various creature ne'er was seen. Francis, in Imitatio. The chameleon tribe is a well-defined family of lizard-like reptiles, whose characters may be summed up as existing in the form of their feet. The toes, which are joined together, or bound up together in two packets or bundles, opposed to each other, in their shagreen-like skin, in their prehensile tail, and in their extensile and retractile verbiform tongue. That the chameleon was known to the ancients there is no doubt. Its name we derive directly from the Cameleo of the Latins. Aristotle's History of the Animal proves the acute observation of that great zoologist, the absence of a sternum, the disposition of the ribs, the mechanism of the tail, the motion of the eyes, the toes bound up in opposable bundles, etc., though he is not entirely correct on some points. Pliny mentions it, but his account is for the most part a compilation from Aristotle. Calmette's description of the chameleon is curiously minute. It has 4 feet, and on each foot 3 claws. Its tail is long. With this, as well as with its feet, it fastens itself to the branches of trees. Its tail is flat, its nose long, ending in an obtuse point. Its back is sharp, its skin plated and jagged like a saw, from the neck to the last joint of the tail, and upon its head it has something like a comb. Like a fish, it has no neck. Some have asserted that it lives only upon air, but it has been observed to feed on flies, catched with its tongue, which is about 10 inches long and 3 thick, made of white flesh, round but flat at the end, or hollow and open, resembling an elephant's trunk. It also shrinks and grows longer. This animal is said to assume the color of those things to which it is applied, but our modern observers assure us that its natural color, when at rest and in the shade, is a bluish gray, though some are yellow, others green, but both of a smaller kind. When it is exposed to the sun, the gray changes into a darker gray, inclining to a dun color, and its parts, which have least of the light upon them, are changed into spots of different colors. Sometimes, when it is handled, it seems speckled with dark spots, inclining to green. If it be put upon a black hat, it appears to be of a violet color, and sometimes, if it be wrapped up in linen, it is white, but it changes color only in some parts of the body. Its changes of color have been commemorated by the poets. Shakespeare has, I can add colors e'en to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantage. Dryden has, the thin chameleon fed with air receives the color of the thing to which it cleaves. Prior has, as to the chameleon, which is known to have no colors of his own, but borrows from his neighbor's hue, his white or black, his green or blue. Gay, in his charming fable of the spaniel and the chameleon, scarce distinguished from the green, makes the latter thus reply to the taunts of the pampered spaniel. Sir, says the sycophant, like you, of old politer life I knew, like you, a courtier born and bred, kings leaned their ear to what I said. My whisper always met success, the ladies praised me for address. I knew to hit each courtier's passion, and flattered every vice in fashion. But Jove, who hates the liar's ways, at once cut short my prosperous days, and, sentenced to retain my nature, transformed me to this crawling creature. Doomed to a life obscure and mean, I wandered in the sylvan scene. For Jove the heart alone regards, He punishes what man rewards. How different is thy case and mine! With men at least you sup and dine, While I, condemned to thinnest fare, Like those I flattered, fed on air. Upon this fable a commentator acutely notes: the raillery at court sycophants naturally pervades our poet's writings, who had suffered so much from them. Here, however, he imitates something more, namely, the apposite dispensations to man's acts, even in this world. The crafty is taken in by his own guile, the courtier falls by his own arts, and the ladder of ambition only prepares for the aspirant a further fall. With respect to the air food of the chameleon, Cuvier observes that its lung is so large that, when it is filled with air, it imparts a transparency to the body, which made the ancients say that it lived upon air; and he inclines to think that to its size the chameleon owes the property of changing its color. But with regard to this last speculation he was wrong, as we shall presently see. It was long thought that the chameleon, like most of the lizard tribe, was produced from an egg. The little animal is, however, most clearly viviparous, and not oviparous, although the tales told of the lizard tribe in the story books are most perplexing. To name a few of them: 1. The crocodile, which is the largest of the lizard tribe, and has even attained the size of 18½ feet in length, is confidently stated as laying eggs, which she covers with sand and leaves, to be hatched by the sun; and these have been met with in the rivers Nile, Niger, and Ganges. 2. Lacerta gangetica, unknown to Linnaeus, but brought to this country from Bengal in 1747 by the late Dr. Mead, is said to be furnished with a false belly like the opossum, where the young can be received for protection in time of danger. In this case the egg must have been hatched in the belly of the animal, like the viper. 3. The alligator, or American crocodile, lays a vast quantity of eggs in the sand, near the banks of lakes and rivers, and leaves them to be hatched by the sun, and the young are seldom seen. 4. The Cayman, or Antilles crocodile, has furnished its eggs to many collections. 5. A salamander was opened by M. Maupertuis, and its belly was found full of eggs, but in Les Mémoires de l'Académie Royale des Sciences it is stated that, after a similar operation of the kind, 50 young ones resembling the parent animal were found in its womb all alive and actively running about the room. The tongue is the chief organ for taking the insects on which the chameleon lives. By a curious mechanism, of which the tongue bone is a principal agent, the chameleon can protrude this cylindrical tongue, which has its tip covered with a glutinous secretion, from the sheath at the lower part of the mouth to the length of 6 inches. When the chameleon is about to seize an insect, it rolls round its extraordinary eyeballs, so as to bring them to bear on the doomed object. As soon as it arrives within the range of the tongue, that organ is projected with unerring precision, and returns into the mouth with the prey adhering to the viscous tip. The wonderful activity with which this feat is performed forms a strong contrast to the almost ridiculously slow motions of the animal. Their operation of taking mealworms, of which they are fond, though comparatively rapid, is not remarkable for its quickness, but done with an act of deliberation, and so that the projection and retraction of the tongue can be very distinctly followed with the eye. The eyes of the chameleon are remarkable objects, large, projecting and almost entirely covered with the shagreen-like skin, with the exception of a small aperture opposite the pupil. Their motions are completely independent of each other. It adds to the strange and grotesque appearance of this creature to see it roll one of its eye globes backwards, while the other is directed forwards, as if making two distinct surveys at one time. Its sight must be acute, from the unerring certainty with which it marks and strikes its prey. The chameleons spend their lives in trees, for clinging to the branches of which their organization is admirably adapted. There they lie in wait for the insects which may come within their reach, and it has been thought that in such situations their faculty of changing color becomes highly important in aiding them to conceal themselves. The powers of abstinence possessed by this singular race are very great, and hence most probably arose the old fable of their living on air, which was for a long time considered to be the chameleon's dish. One has been known to fast upwards of 6 weeks without taking any sustenance, though meat food and insects were procured for it. Notwithstanding this fast, it did not appear to fall away much. It would fix itself by the feet and tail to the bars of the fender, and there remain motionless, enjoying the warmth of the fire for hours together. Hasselquist describes one that he kept for nearly a month as climbing up and down the bars of its cage in a very lively manner. The power of the chameleon's changing color long exercised the ingenuity of the old naturalists. Hasselquist thought that the changes of color depended on a kind of disease, more especially a sort of jaundice to which the animal was subject, particularly when it was put in a rage. Monsieur d'Alsonville thought that he had discovered the secret in the blood, and that the change of color depended upon a mixture of blue and yellow, whence the different shades of green were derived. And these colors he obtains from the blood and the blood vessels. Thus he says that the blood is of a violet hue, and will retain its color on linen or paper for some minutes, if previously steeped in a solution of alum, and that the coats of the vessels are yellow. Consequently, he argues that the mixture of the two will produce green. He further traces the change of color to the passions of the animal. Thus, when a healthy chameleon is provoked, the circulation is accelerated, the vessels that are spread over the skin are distended, and a superficial blue-green color is produced. When, on the contrary, the animal is imprisoned, impoverished, and deprived of free air, the circulation becomes languid, the vessels are not filled, the color of their coats prevails, and the chameleon changes to a yellow-green, which lasts during its confinement. Barrow, in his Travels in Africa, declares that previously to the chameleon's assuming a change of color, it makes a long inspiration, the body swelling out to twice its usual size, and as the inflation subsides, the change of color gradually takes place, the only permanent marks being 2 small dark lines passing along the sides. Mr. Wood conceives from this account that the animal is principally indebted for these varied tints to the influence of oxygen. Mr. Spittal also regards these changes as connected with the state of the lungs, and Mr. Houston considers this phenomenon as dependent on the turgescency of the skin. Dr. Weissenborn thinks it not unlikely that the nervous currents may directly cooperate in effecting the changes of color in the chameleon. Mr. H. N. Turner, writing from personal observation of the phenomenon in a live chameleon in his possession, says, "It has been generally imagined that the purpose of the singular faculty accorded to the chameleon is to enable it to accommodate its appearance to that of surrounding objects. Mr. Turner's observations do not, however, favor the idea, but seem rather to negative it. The box in which Mr. Turner's chameleon was kept was of deal, with glass at the top, and a piece of flannel laid at the bottom, a small branching stick being placed there by way of a perch. He introduced at various times pieces of colored paper, covering the bottom of the box, of blue, yellow, and scarlet, but without the slightest effect upon the appearance of the animal. Considering that these primary colors were not such as it would be likely to be placed in contact with in a state of nature, he next tried a piece of green calico, but equally without result. The animal went through all its usual changes without their being in any way modified by the color placed underneath it. The general tint approximated, as may be readily observed, to those of the branches of trees, just as those of most animals do to the places in which they dwell. But Mr. Turner did not observe the faculty of changing called into play with any apparent object. It is only when the light is removed that the animal assumes a color which absorbs but little of it. Not to go further into the numerous treatises which have been published on this intricate subject, without arriving at a just conclusion, we refer to the able and interesting paper of Mr. Milne Edwards, for whose acuteness the solution of this puzzling phenomenon was reserved. The steps by which he first overthrew the received theories on the subject, and then arrived at the cause of the change of color, is shown in the following results, derived from observing 2 chameleons living, and researches after the animals had died on the structure of their skin, and the parts immediately beneath it. 1. That the change in the color of the chameleon does not depend essentially either on the more or less considerable swelling of their bodies, or the changes which might hence result to the condition of their blood or circulation, nor does it depend on the greater or less distance which may exist between the several cutaneous tubercles, although it is not to be denied that these circumstances probably exercise some influence upon the phenomenon. 2. That there exist in the skin of these animals 2 layers of membranous pigment, placed the one above the other, but disposed in such a way as to appear simultaneously under the cuticle, and sometimes in such a manner that the one may hide the other. 3. That everything remarkable in the changes of color in the chameleon may be explained by the appearance of the pigment of the deeper layer, to an extent more or less considerable, in the midst of the pigment of the superficial layer, or from its disappearance beneath this layer. 4. That these displacements of the deeper pigment do in reality occur, and it is a probable consequence that the chameleon's color changes during life, and may continue to change even after death. 5. That there exists a close analogy between the mechanism by the help of which the change of color appears to take place in these reptiles, and that which determines the successive appearance and disappearance of colored spots in the mantles of several of the cephalopods. Chameleons are found in warm climates of the Old World, south of Spain, Africa, East Indies, Isles of Seychelles, Bourbon, France, Moluccas, Madagascar, where it is said there are 7 of the species which belong to Africa, Fernando Po, and New South Wales. In the year 1860, a new and curiously formed species of chameleon was brought from the interior of the old Calabar district of West Africa by one of the natives. It is characterized by 3 horny processes on the head. Many lizards have singular spiky projections on all parts of the body, but this very well-marked species had not been hitherto recorded. Mrs. Belzoni, the wife of the celebrated traveler in the East, made some careful observations upon the habits of chameleons, which are worth quoting. The Arabs in Lower Egypt catch chameleons by jumping upon them, flinging stones at them, or striking them with sticks, which hurts them very much. The Nubians lay them down gently on the ground, and when they come down from the date trees, they catch hold of the tail of the animal and fix a string to it. Therefore the body does not get injured. Mrs. Belzoni had some chameleons for several months in her house, and her observations are as follows. In the first place, they are very inveterate towards each other, and must not be shut up together, else they will bite each other's tails and legs off. There are 3 species of chameleons whose colors are peculiar to themselves. For instance, the commonest sort are those which are generally green, that is to say, the body all green, and when content, beautifully marked on each side regularly on the green with black and yellow, not in a confused manner, but as if drawn. This kind is in great plenty. They never have any other color except a light green when they sleep, and when ill a very pale yellow. Out of near 40 I had the first year when in Nubia, I had but 1, and that a very small one of the second sort, which had red marks. One chameleon lived with me 8 months, and most of that time I had it fixed to the button of my coat. It used to rest on my shoulder or on my head. I have observed, when I have kept it shut up in a room for some time, that on bringing it out in the air it would begin drawing the air in, and on putting it on some marjoram it has had a wonderful effect on it immediately. Its color became most brilliant. I believe it will puzzle a good many to say what cause it proceeds from. If they did not change when shut up in a house, but only on taking them in a garden, it might be supposed the change of the colors was in consequence of the smell of the plants. But when in a house, if it is watched, it will change every 10 minutes. Some moments a plain green, at others all its beautiful colors will come out, and when in a passion it becomes of a deep black, and will swell itself up like a balloon, and from being one of the most beautiful animals it becomes one of the most ugly. It is true that chameleons are extremely fond of the fresh air, and on taking them to a window when there is nothing to be seen, it is easy to observe the pleasure they certainly take in it. They begin to gulp down the air, and their color becomes brighter. I think it proceeds, in a great degree, from the temper they are in. A little thing will put them in a bad humor. If in crossing a table, for instance, you stop them, and attempt to turn them another road, they will not stir, and are extremely obstinate. On opening the mouth at them, it will set them in a passion. They begin to arm themselves by swelling and turning black, and will sometimes hiss a little, but not much. The third I brought from Jerusalem was the most singular of all the chameleons I ever had. Its temper, if it can be so called, was extremely sagacious and cunning. This one was not of the order of the green kind, but a disagreeable drab, and it never once varied in its color in 2 months. On my arrival in Cairo, I used to let it crawl about the room on the furniture. Sometimes it would get down, if it could, and hide itself away from me, but in a place where it could see me. And sometimes on my leaving the room, and on entering it, would draw itself so thin as to make itself nearly on a level with whatever it might be on, so that I might not see it. It had often deceived me so. One day, having missed it for some time, I concluded it was hid about the room. After looking for it in vain, I thought it had got out of the room and made its escape. In the course of the evening, after the candle was lighted, I went to a basket that had got a handle across it. I saw my chameleon, but its color entirely changed, and different to any I ever had seen before. The whole body, head and tail, a brown with black spots, and beautiful deep orange colored spots round the black. I certainly was much gratified. On being disturbed, its colors vanished, unlike the others. But after this I used to observe it the first thing in the morning, when it would have the same colors. Some time after, it made its escape out of my room, and I suppose got into the garden close by. I was much vexed, and would have given $20 to have recovered it again, though it only cost me 3d, knowing I could not get another like it, for afterwards, being in Rosetta, I had between 50 and 60, but all those were green, yellow, and black, and the Arabs in catching them had bruised them so much that after a month or 6 weeks they died. It is an animal extremely hard to die. I had prepared 2 cages with separate divisions, with the intention of bringing them to England. But though I desired the Arabs that used to get them for me to catch them by the tail, they used to hurt them much with their hands, and if once the body is squeezed, it will never live longer than 2 months. When they used to sleep at night, it was easy to see where they had been bruised, for being of a very light color when sleeping, the part that had been bruised, either on the body or the head, which was bone, was extremely black, though when green it would not show itself so clear. Their chief food was flies. The fly does not die immediately on being swallowed, for upon taking the chameleon up in my hands, it was easy to feel the fly buzzing, chiefly on account of the air they draw in their inside. They swell much, and particularly when they want to fling themselves off a great height, by filling themselves up like a balloon. On falling they get no hurt, except on the mouth, which they bruise a little, as that comes first to the ground. Sometimes they will not drink for 3 or 4 days, and when they begin they are about half an hour drinking. I have held a glass in one hand while the chameleon rested its 2 forepaws on the edge of it, the 2 hind ones resting on my other hand. It stood upright while drinking, holding its head up like a fowl. By flinging its tongue out of its mouth the length of its body, and instantaneously catching the fly, it would go back like a spring. They will drink mutton broth. How I came to know this was, one day having a plate of broth and rice on the table where it was, it went to the plate and got half into it, and began drinking, and trying to take up some of the rice, by pushing it with its mouth towards the side of the plate, which kept it from moving, and in a very awkward way taking it into its mouth. In the autumn of 1868, a pair of chameleons, in the possession of the Honourable Lady Cust of Leasaway Castle, Cheshire, produced 9 active young ones, like little alligators, less than an inch long. Such a birth has been, it is believed, very rare in this country. It was remarked in the above case that the male and female appeared altogether indifferent about their progeny. Whatever may be the cause, the fact seems to be certain that the chameleon has an antipathy to objects of a black color. One which Forbes kept uniformly avoided a blackboard, which was hung up in the chamber, and what is most remarkable, when the chameleon was held forcibly before the blackboard, it trembled violently and assumed a black color. It may be something of the same kind which makes bulls and turkey cocks dislike the color of scarlet, a fact of which there can be no doubt. End of section 26.
Section 27 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Laurie Wilson. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Running Toads. That the toad, by common repute ugly and venomous, should be made a parlor pet is passing strange. Yet such is the case, and we find in a letter from Dr. Hussenbeth of Cossey the following curious instances. Thus he describes a species there often met with, the eyes of which the pupil surrounded with bright golden yellow, whereas in the common toad the circle is red or orange. This remarkable peculiarity Dr. H. has not seen anywhere noticed. The head is like that of the common sort, but much more blunt and rounded off at the nose and mouth, and the arches over the eyes are more prominent. The most remarkable difference is a line of yellow running all down the back. Also down each side this toad has a row of red pimples, like small beads, which are tolerably regular, but appear more in some specimens than in others. The general color is a yellowish olive, but the animal is beautifully marked with black spots, very regularly disposed, and exactly corresponding on each side of the yellow line down the back. Like all other toads, this one occasionally changes its color, becoming more brown or ash color or reddish at times, probably in certain states of the weather. This species is much more active than the common toad. It never leaps and very seldom crawls, but makes a short run, stops a little, and then runs on again. If frightened or pursued, it will run along much quicker than one would suppose. During the previous summer, Dr. H. kept 3 toads of this kind in succession. The first, says Dr. H., I procured in July, but after a few days, when I let him have a run on the carpet of my parlor, he got into a hole in a corner of the floor, of which I was not aware, and fell, as I suppose, underneath the floor, into the hollow space below. I concluded that he could never get up again, and gave him up to his fate. I then began to keep another running toad, which fed well at first, but after 3 weeks refused food, and evidently wasted. So I turned him out into the garden, and have not met with him since. After more than 3 weeks the former toad appeared, but how he came up from underneath the floor I never could conceive, or how he had picked up a living in the meantime. He was, however, in good condition, and seemed to have lived well, probably on spiders and woodlice. He had been seen by a servant running about the carpet, but I knew nothing of his having come forth again till in the evening, when he had got near the door, and it was suddenly opened so as to pass over the poor creature and crush it terribly. I took it up apparently dead, and showed no sign of life. The eyes were closed, it did not breathe, and the backbone seemed quite broken, and the animal was crushed almost flat. I found a very curious milky secretion exuding from it, where it had been most injured, and the skin was most broken. This was perfectly white, and had exactly the appearance of milk thrown over the toad. It did not bleed, though much lacerated, but instead of blood appeared this milky fluid, which had an odor of a most singular kind, differing from anything I ever smelt. It is impossible to describe it. It was not fetid, but of a sickly, disgusting, and overpowering character, so that I could not endure to inhale it for a moment. I had read and seen a good deal of the extraordinary powers of revivification in toads, but was not prepared for what I witnessed on this occasion. I laid this poor animal crushed, flattened, motionless, and to all appearances dead, upon a cold iron plate of the fireplace. He fell over on one side, and showed no sign of life for a full hour. After that he had slightly moved one leg, and so remained for about another half-hour. Then he began to breathe feebly, and gathered up his legs, and his back began to rise up into its usual form. In about 2 hours from the time of the accident he had so far recovered as to crawl about, though with difficulty. The milky liquor was reabsorbed and gradually disappeared as the toad recovered. The next morning it was all gone, and no mark of injury could be seen, except for a small hole in his back, which soon closed. He recovered so far as to move about pretty well, but his back appeared to have been broken and one foreleg crippled. I therefore thought it best to give him his liberty in the garden. But so wonderful and speedy a recovery I could never have believed without ocular testimony. I then tried my third and last running toad. I began to keep him on September 13th. He was a very fine specimen, and larger than the two former. He fed well and amused me exceedingly. He was very tame and would sit on my hand quite quiet, and enjoy my stroking him gently down his head and back. Soon after I got him he began to cast his skin. I helped him to get rid of it by stripping it down each side, which he seemed to like much, and sat very quiet during the operation. The new skin was quite beautiful and shone as if varnished. This toad lived in a crystal palace or glass jar, where I had kept all the others before him. He took food freely, and his appetite was good, that in one day he ate 7 large flies and 3 bees without stings. He was particularly fond of woodlice and earwigs, and would take centipedes, moths, and even butterflies. Being more active than common toads, he often made great efforts to get out of his glass jar. I used to let him run about the room nearly every day for a short time, and often treated him to a run in the garden. Toads make a slight noise sometimes in the evenings, uttering a short sound like coo, but I never heard them croak. Before wet weather and during its continuance, my toad was disinclined for food, and took no notice of flies even walking over his nose. He would then burrow and hide himself in the moss at the bottom of his glass palace. Thus I kept him, and found him very tame and amusing. But after about 2 months he became more impatient of confinement, and refused to take any food. I did not perceive that he fell away, though his feet and toes turned of a dark color, which I knew was a sign of being out of condition. And on the 10th of November I found him dead. I have now tried 3 of this sort, and have come to the conclusion that the running toad will not live in captivity. This I much regret, as its habits are interesting and its ways very amusing. F. C. Hussenbeth, D.D. Frog and Toad Concerts. It would be hard to believe the stories of the vocal powers of frogs and toads were they not related by trustworthy travelers who tell of animal concerts. Wild as the marsh and tuneful as the harp. Mr. Priest, the traveler in America, who was himself a musician, records, "Prepared as I was to hear something extraordinary from these animals, I confess the first frog concert I heard in America was so much beyond anything I could conceive of, the power of these musicians, that I was truly astonished. This performance was al fresco, and took place on the 18th of April in a large swamp where there were at least 10,000 performers, and I really believe not too exactly in the same pitch, if the octave can possibly admit of so many divisions or shades of semitones." Professor and Mrs. Louis Agassiz, in their recent Journey in Brazil, record, "We must not leave Para without alluding to our evening concerts from the adjoining woods and swamps. When I first heard this strange confusion of sounds, I thought it came from a crowd of men shouting loudly, though at a little distance. To my surprise, I found that the rioters were the frogs and toads in the neighborhood. I hardly know how to describe this babel of woodland noises, and if I could do it justice, I am afraid my account would hardly be believed. At moments it seems like the barking of dogs, then like the calling of many voices on different keys, but all loud, rapid, excited, full of emphasis and variety. I think these frogs, like ours, must be silent at certain seasons of the year, for on our first visit to Para we were not struck by this singular music with which the woods now resound at nightfall." End of section 27.
Section 28 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by David Lawrence in Ottawa, Ontario, December 2023. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Song of the Cicada. The Greeks have been scoffed at for rendering in deathless verse the song of so insignificant an insect as the cicada, and hence it has been asserted that their love for such slender music must have been either exaggerated or simulated. It is pleasant, however, to hear an independent observer in the other hemisphere confirm their testimony. Mr. Lord tells us that in British Columbia there is one sound or song which is clearer, shriller, and more singularly tuneful than any other. It never appears to cease, and it comes from everywhere, from the tops of the trees, from the trembling leaves of the cottonwood, from the stunted underbrush, from the flowers, the grass, the rocks and boulders. Nay, the very stream itself seems vocal with hidden minstrels, all chanting the same refrain. An especial feature of the cicada's song is that it increases in intensity when the sun is hottest, and one of the later Latin poets mentions the time when its music is at its highest, as an alternative expression for noon. Mr. Tennyson inadvertently speaks in Anon of the grasshopper being silent in the grass, and of the cicada sleeping when the noonday quiet holds the hill. Keats sings more truly, quote, "When all the birds are faint with the hot sun, and hide in cool trees, a voice will run from hedge to hedge above the new-mown mead. That is the grasshopper's." Unquote. Then the Greek poets show us how intimately the song of the cicada is associated with the hottest hours of the day. Aristophanes described it as mad for the love of the sun, and Theocritus as scorched by the sun. When all things are parched with the heat, says Aclaeus, then from among the leaves issue the song of the sweet cicada. His shrill melody is heard in the full glow of noontide, and the vertical rays of a torrid sun fire him to sing. Over and over again Mr. Lord met with allusions to the same peculiarity. Cicadae are regularly sold for food in the markets of South America. They are not eaten now, like they were at Athens, as a whet to the appetite, but they are dried in the sun, powdered, and made into a cake. End of section 28.
Section 29 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Stories about the Barnacle Goose. As barnacles turn Poland geese in the islands of the Orcades. Hudibras. One of the earliest references to this popular error is in the Natural Magic of Baptista Porta, who says, "Late writers report that not only in Scotland, but also in the river of Thames by London, there is a kind of shellfish in a 2-leaved shell that hath a foot full of plates and wrinkles. They commonly stick to the keel of some old ship. Some say they come of worms, some of the boughs of trees, which fall into the sea. If any of them be cast upon shore, they die. But they which are swallowed still into the sea live and get out of their shells, and grow to be ducks or such like birds." Professor Max Müller, in a learned lecture, enters fully into the origin of the different stories about the barnacle goose. He quotes from the Philosophical Transactions of 1678 a full account by Sir Robert Moray, who declared that he had seen within the barnacle shell, as through a concave or diminishing glass, the bill, eyes, head, neck, breast, wings, tail, feet, and feathers of the barnacle goose. The next witness was John Gerard, master in chirurgery, who in 1597 declared that he had seen the actual metamorphosis of the mussel into the bird, describing how "the shell gapeth open, and the first thing that appeareth is the aforesaid lace or string. Next come the leg of the bird hanging out, and as it groweth greater, it openeth the shell by degrees, till at length it is all come forth, and hangeth only by the bill, and falleth into the sea, when it gathereth feathers and groweth to a fowl bigger than a mallard. For the truth hereof, if any doubt, may it please them to repair to me, and I shall satisfy them by the testimonies of good witnesses. As far back as the 13th century, the same story is traced in the writings of Giraldus Cambrensis. This great divine does not deny the truth of the miraculous origin of the barnacle geese, but he warns the Irish priests against dining off them during Lent, in the plea that they were not flesh, but fish. For he writes, if a man during Lent were to dine off a leg of Adam, who was not born of flesh either, we should not consider him innocent of having eaten what is flesh. This modern myth, which, in spite of the protests of such men as Albertus Magnus, Aeneas Sylvius, and others, maintained its ground for many centuries, and was defended as late as 1629 in a book by Count Meyer, De Volucria Arborea, with arguments physical, metaphysical, and theological, owed its origin to a play of words. The mussel shells are called Barnaculi, from the Latin perna, the medieval Latin berna. The birds are called Hibernici or Hiberniculi, abbreviated to Berniculi. As their names seem one, the creatures are supposed to be one, and everything conspires to confirm the first mistake and to invest what was originally a good Irish story, a mere canard, and with all the dignity of scientific and all the solemnity of theological truth. The myth continued to live until the age of Newton. Specimens of Lepididae prepared by Professor Rolleston of Oxford show how the outward appearance of the Anatifera could have supported the popular superstition which derived from the bernicla, the goose, from bernicula, the shell. Drayton, 1613, in his Polyalbion 3, in connection with the river Lee, speaks of the anatomized fish and fowls from planchers sprung. To which a note is appended in Southey's edition, page 609, that such fowls were barnacles, a bird breeding upon old ships. A bunch of the shells attached to the ship, or to a piece of floating timber, at a distance appears like flowers in bloom. The foot of the animal has a similitude to the stalk of a plant growing from the ship's sides. The shell resembles a calyx, and the flower consists of the tentacula or fingers of the shellfish. The ancient error was to mistake the foot for the neck of a goose, the shell for its head, and the tentacula for feathers. As to the body, non est inventus. Sir Kenelm Digby was soundly laughed at for relating to a party at the castle of the governor of Calais that the barnacle, a bird in Jersey, was first a shellfish to appearance, and from that striking upon old wood became in time a bird. In 1807 there was exhibited in Spring Gardens, London, a wonderful natural curiosity called the goose tree, barnacle tree, or tree bearing geese, taken up at sea on January 12th, and more than 20 men could raise out of the water. Sir J. Emerson Tennant asks whether the ready acceptance and general credence given to so obvious a fable may not have been derived from giving too literal a construction to the text of the passage in the first chapter of Genesis. And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and the fowl that may fly in the open firmament of heaven. The barnacle goose is a well-known bird, and is eaten on fast days in France, by virtue of this old belief in its marine origin. The belief in the barnacle origin of the bird still prevails on the west coast of Ireland and in the western highlands of Scotland. The finding of the barnacle is thus described by Mr. Sidenbotham to the Microscopical and Natural History section of the Literary and Philosophical Society. In September I was at Latham with my family. The day was very stormy, and the previous night there had been a strong southwest wind, and evidences of a very stormy sea outside the banks. 2 of my children came running to tell me of a very strange creature that had been washed up on the shore. They had seen it from the pier, and pointing it out to a sailor, thinking it was a large dog with long hair. On reaching the shore I found a fine mass of barnacles, Pentalesimus anatifera, attached to some staves of a cask, the whole thing being between 4 and 5 feet long. Several sailors had secured the prize, and were getting it on a truck to carry it away. The appearance was most remarkable, the hundreds of long tubes with their curious shells looking like what one would fancy the fabled Gorgon's head with its snaky locks. The curiosity was carried to a yard where it was to be exhibited, and the bellman went round to announce it under the name of the sea lioness, or the great sea serpent. Another mass of barnacles was washed up at Lytham, and also one at Blackpool, the same day or the following. This mass of barnacles was evidently just such a one as that seen by Gerard at the Pile of Falthers. It is rare to have such a specimen on our coasts. The sailors at Lytham have never seen anything like it, although some of them were old men who had spent all their lives on the coast. End of section 29. Section 30 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Leaves about bookworms. On paper, leather, and parchment are found various animals popularly known as bookworms. Johnson describes it as a worm or mite that eats holes in books, chiefly when damp, and in The Guardian we find this reference to its habits. My lion, like a moth or bookworm, feeds upon nothing but paper. Many years ago, an experienced keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford collected these interesting details of bookworms. The larvae of Crambus pinguinalis will establish themselves upon the binding of a book, and spinning a robe will do it little injury. A mite, Acarus eruditus, eats the paste that fastens the paper over the edge of the binding, and so loosens it. The caterpillar of another little moth takes its station in damp old books between the leaves, and there commits great ravages. The little boring wood beetle who attacks books and will even bore through several volumes. An instance is mentioned of 27 folio volumes being perforated in a straight line by the same insect in such a manner that by passing a cord through the perfect round hole made by it, the 27 volumes could be raised at once. The wood beetle also destroys prints and drawings, whether framed or kept in a portfolio. There is another bookworm which is often confounded with the death watch of the vulgar, but is smaller, and instead of beating at intervals, as does the death watch, continues its noise for a considerable length of time without intermission. It is usually found in old wood, decayed furniture, museums, and neglected books. The female lays her eggs, which are exceedingly small, in dry, dusty places, where they are least likely to meet with disturbance. They are generally hatched about the beginning of March, a little sooner or later, according to the weather. After leaving the eggs, the insects are so small as to be scarcely discerned without the use of a glass. They remain in this state about 2 months, somewhat resembling in appearance the mites in cheese, after which they undergo their change into the perfect insect. They feed on dead flies and other insects, and often from their numbers and voracity very much deface cabinets of natural history. They subsist on various other substances, and may often be observed carefully hunting for nutritious particles amongst the dust in which they are found, turning it over with their heads, and searching about in manner of swine. Many live through the winter buried deep in the dust to avoid the frost. The best mode of destroying the insects which infest books and manuscripts has often occupied the attention of the possessors of valuable libraries. Sir Thomas Phillips found the wood of his bookcase attacked, particularly where beech had been introduced, and appeared to think that the insect was much attracted by the paste employed in binding. He recommended as preservatives against their attacks spirits of turpentine and solution of corrosive sublimate, and also the latter substance mixed with paste. In some instances he found the produce of a single impregnated female sufficient to destroy a book. Turpentine and spirit of tar are also recommended for their destruction. But the method pursued in the collections of the British Museum is an abundant supply of camphor, with attention to keeping the rooms dry, warm, and ventilated. Mr. mleigh states it is the acari which only feed on the paste employed in binding books, and the larvae of the coleoptera only which pierce the boards and leaves. The ravages of the bookworm would be much more destructive had there not been a sort of guardian to the literary treasures in the shape of a spider, who, when examined through a microscope, resembles a knight in armor. This champion of the library follows the worm into the bookcase, discovers the pit he has digged, rushes on his victim, which is about his own size, and devours him. His repast finished, he rests for about a fortnight, and when his digestion is completed, he sets out to break another lance with the enemy. The death watch, already referred to, and which must be acquitted of destroying books, is chiefly known by the noise which he makes behind the wainscoting, where he ticks like a clock or watch. How so loud a noise is produced by so small an insect has never been properly explained, and the ticking has led to many legends. The naturalist De Geer relates that one night in the autumn of 1809, during an entomological excursion in Brittany, where travellers were scarce and accommodations bad, he sought hospitality at the house of a friend. He was from home, and De Geer found a great deal of trouble in gaining admittance. But at last the peasant who had charge of the house told De Geer that he would give him the chamber of death, if he liked. As De Geer was much fatigued, he accepted the offer. "The bed is there," said the man, "but no one has slept in it for some time. Every night the spirit of the officer who was surprised and killed in this room by some Chouans comes back. When the officer was dead, the peasants divided what he had about him, and the officer's watch fell to my uncle, who was delighted with the prize, and brought it home to examine it. However, he soon found out that the watch was broken, and would not go. He then placed it under his pillow, and went to sleep. He awoke in the night, and to his terror heard the ticking of a watch. In vain he sold the watch, and gave the money for masses to be said for the officer's soul. The ticking continued, and has never ceased." De Geer said that he would exorcise the chamber, and the peasant left him after making the sign of the cross. The naturalist at once guessed the riddle, and, accustomed to the pursuit of insects, soon had a couple of death watches shut up in a tin case, and the ticking was reproduced. Swift has prescribed this destructive remedy by way of ridicule. "A woodworm that lies in old wood like a hare in her form, with teeth or with claws it will bite, or will scratch, and chambermaids christen this worm a death watch, because like a watch it always cries click. Then woe to those in the house that are sick, for sure as a gun they will give up the ghost if the maggot cries click when it scratches the post. But a kettle of scalding hot water ejected infallibly cures the timber affected. The omen is broken, the danger is over. The maggot will die, the sick will recover." End of section 30. Section 31 of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs. Boring marine animals and human engineers. Where a young naturalist asked to exemplify what man has learned from the lower animals, he could scarcely adduce a more striking instance than that of a submarine Shelley worker teaching him how to execute some of his noblest works. This we have learned from the life and labors of the Phallus, of which it has been emphatically said, "Numerous accounts have been published during the last 14 years in every civilized country and language of the boring process of the Phallus, and machines formed in the model of its mechanism have for years been tunneling Mont Cenis." In the Eastern Zoological Gallery of the British Museum, cases 35 and 36, as well as in the Museum of Economic Geology in Piccadilly, may be seen specimens of the above very curious order of conchifers, most of the members of which are distinguished by their habits of boring or digging, a process in which they are assisted by the peculiar formation of the foot, from which they derive their name. Of these 10 families, one of the most characteristic is that of the razor shells, which, when the valves are shut, are of a long flattened cylindrical shape, and open at both ends. Projecting its strong pointed foot at one of these ends, the solen can work itself down into the sand with great rapidity, while at the upper end its respiratory tubes are shot out to bring the water to its gills. Of the Phallidae, the shells of which are sometimes called multivalve, because in addition to the 2 chief portions they have a number of smaller accessory pieces, some bore in hard mud, others in wood, and others in rocks. They fix themselves firmly by the powerful foot, and then make the shell revolve. The sharp edges of this commences the perforation, which is afterwards enlarged by the rasp-like action of the rough exterior. And though the shell must be constantly worn down, yet it is replaced by a new formation from the animal, so as never to be unfit for its purpose. The typical bivalve of this family is the thallus, which bores into limestone rock and other hard material, and commits ravages on the piers, breakwaters, etc., that it selects for a home. In the same family as the above, Dr. Gray ranks Teredo. Footnote: How Brunel took his construction of the Thames tunnel from observing the bore of the Teredo navalis in the keel of a ship in 1814 is well known. End footnote. Or wood-boring mollusk, whose ravages on ships, piles, wooden piers, etc., at sea resemble those of the white ant on furniture, joints of houses, etc., on shore, perforating the timber by exactly the same process as that by which the phallus perforates the stones. The teredo advances continually, eating out a contorted tube or gallery, which it lines behind it with a calcareous matter, and through which it continues to breathe the water. The priority of the demonstration of the phallus and its boring habits has been much disputed. The evidence is full of curious details. It appears that Mr. Harper of Edinburgh, author of The Seaside and Aquarium, having claimed the lead. Mr. Robertson of Brighton writes to dispute the originality, adding that he publicly exhibited Phyllades in the pavilion at Brighton in July 1851, perforating chalk rocks by the raspings of their valves and squirtings of their siphons. Professor Fleurens, says Mr. Robertson, taught my observations to his class in Paris in 1853. I published them in 1851, and again more fully in the Journal de Cochoriologie in 1853. And M. Émile Blanchard illustrated them in the same year in his Organisation du Règne Animal. I published a popular account of the perforating process in Household Words in 1856. After obtaining the suffrages of the French authorities, I have been recently honored with those of the British naturalists. See Woodward's Recent and Fossil Shells, family, Phylladidae. On returning to England last autumn, I exhibited perforating Phyllades to all the naturalists who cared to watch them. An intelligent lady whom I supplied with Phyllades has made a really new and original observation, which I may take this opportunity to communicate to the public. She observed two Phyllades whose perforations were bringing them nearer and nearer to each other. Their mutual raspings were wearing away the thin partition which separated their crypts. She was curious to know what they would do when they met, and watched them closely. When the two perforating shellfish met and found themselves in each other's way, the stronger just bored right through the weaker phallus. Mr. Robertson has communicated to Jameson's Journal, No. 101, the results of his opportunities of studying the phallus during 6 months to discover how the mollusk makes its hole or crypt in the chalk, by chemical solvent, by absorption, by ciliary currents, or by rotary motions. Between 20 and 30 of these creatures were at work in lumps of chalk, in sea water in a finger glass, and open for 3 months, and by watching their operations, Mr. Robertson became convinced that the phallus makes its hole by grating the chalk with its rasp-like valves, licking it up when pulverized with its foot, forcing it up through its principal brambial siphon, and squirting it out in oblong nodules. The crypt protects the phallus from confervae, which, when they get at it, grow not merely outside but even with the lips of the valves, preventing the action of the siphons. In the foot there is a gelatinous spring or style, which even when taken out has great elasticity, and which seems like the mainspring of the motions of the phallus. Upon this Dr. James Stark of Edinburgh writes, Mr. Robertson of Brighton claims the merit of teaching that Phyllades perforate rocks by the rasping of their valves and the squirting of their siphons. His observations only appear to reach back to 1851, but the late Mr. John Stark of Edinburgh, author of the Elements of Natural History, read a paper before the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1826, which was printed in the Society's Transactions of that year, in which he demonstrated that the Phyllades perforate the shale rocks in which they occur on the coast, by means of rasping of their valves and not by acids or other secretions. From also finding that their shells scratched limestone without injury to the fine rasping rugosities, he inferred that it was by the same agency they perforated the hard limestone rocks. To this Mr. Robertson replies that Mr. Osler also in 1826 demonstrated that the Phallodes perforate the shell rocks by means of the rasping of their valves, and more, for he actually witnessed a rotary movement. But Reaumur and Pouilly had done as much as this in the 18th century, and Sebald in the 17th century, and yet I found the solvent hypothesis in the ascendant among naturalists in 1835, when I first interested myself in the controversy. What I did in 1851 was, I exhibited Phallodes at work perforating rocks and explained how they did it. What I have done is, I have made future controversy impossible by exhibiting the animals at work and by discovering the anatomy and the physiology of perforating instruments. In the words of M. Flourens, I made the animals work before my eyes, and I made known their mechanism. The discovery of the function of the hyaline stylet is not merely a new discovery, it is the discovery of a kind of instrument as yet unique in physiology. Mr. Harper, having termed the boring organ of the phallus the hyaline stylet, found it to have puzzled some of the disputants, whereupon Mr. Harper writes, "Its use up to the present time has been a mystery, but the general opinion of the authors seems to be that it is the gizzard of the phallus. This I very much doubt, for it is my belief that the presence of such an important muscle is solely for the purpose of aiding the animal's boring operations. Being situated in the center of the foot, we can readily conceive the great increase of strength thus conveyed to the latter member, which is made to act as a powerful fulcrum, by the exercise of which the animal rotates, and at the same time presses its shell against and rasps the surface of the rock. The question being asked, how can the stylet be procured to satisfy curiosity? I answer by adopting the following extremely simple plan. Having disentombed a specimen with the point of a sharp instrument, cut a slit in the base of its foot, and the object of your search will be distinctly visible in the shape of, I may so term it, an opal cylinder. Sometimes I have seen the point of this organ spring out beyond the incision made above as described." Lastly, Mr. Harper presented the editor of the Athenaeum with a piece of bored rock, of which he has several specimens. He adds, "On examination, you will perceive that the larger phallus must have bored through its smaller and weaker neighbor, how suggestive, the shell of the latter most fortunately remaining in its own cavity." Now Mr. Robertson claimed for his observation of this phenomenon novelty and originality, but Mr. Harper stoutly maintained it to be as common to the eye of the practised geologist as rain or sunshine. The details are curious, though some impatient and not very grateful reader may imagine himself in the condition of the shell of the smaller phallus, and will be, as he deserves to remain, in the minority. It may be interesting to sum up a few of the opinions of the mode by which these boring operations are performed. Professor Forbes states the mode by which mollusks bore into wood and other materials is as follows. Some of the Gotthardspods have tongues covered with silica to enable them to bore, and it was probably by some process of this kind that all mollusks bored. Mr. Peach never observed the species of phallus to turn round in their holes, as stated by some observers, although he had watched them with great attention. Mr. Charlesworth refers to the fact that in one species of shell, not only does the hole in the rock which the animal occupies increase in size, but also the hole through which it projects its siphons. Professor John Phillips, alluding to the theories which have been given to the mode in which mollusks bore into the rocks in which they live, believes that an exclusively mechanical theory will not account for the phenomenon, and he is inclined to adopt the view of Dr. T. Williams, that the boring of the Phallodes can only be explained on the principle which involves a chemical as well as a mechanical agency. Mr. E. Leigh Lancaster notices that the boring of annelids seems quite unknown, and he mentions two cases, one by a worm called Leucodore, the other by a Sabella. Leucodore is very abundant on some shores, where boulders and pebbles may be found worm-eaten and riddled by them. Only stones composed of carbonate of lime are bored by them. On coasts where such stones are rare, they are selected and others are left. The worms are quite soft and armed only with horny bristles. How then do they bore? Mr. Lancaster maintains that it is by carbonic acid and other acid excretions of their bodies, aided by the mechanical action of their bristles. The selection of a material soluble in these acids is most notable, since the softest chalk and the hardest limestone are bored with the same facility. This can only be done by chemical action. If then we have a case of chemical boring in these worms, is it not probable that many mollusks are similarly assisted in their excavation? End of section 31. End of Eccentricities of the Animal Creation by John Timbs.